Today I would like to tell you another incredible and true story about understanding, tolerance, and friendship. Of course, I was with my old classmate, Mr. Dawes, at recess in 1941. You see, back in those days, things were different. The boys only went to the boys' restroom. So remember, a rich white boy went to the girls' restroom once in the 8th grade. He thought he was a comedic genius. The English teacher was watching the whole time. He waited outside the door until the boy came out. When he did, our teacher immediately punched him as hard as he could in the mouth. That very same day, he was promoted to vice principal. We decided to leave school early that day. Ever the true gentleman, Mr. Dawes suggested that we just wait until school was over and then go to the soda shop. I'm sure he wanted to go flirt with what would likely be some demon-possessed girls, but folks, I was a rebel. In his cavalier way of speaking, he tried to sway me out of this adventure. Sleepy Joe, we will both get suspended if we leave now. Then I'll likely be whipped like a rented mule and thrown into an insane asylum. Mr. Dawes, I'd say to him, I have already had my parents call her folks 3 days ago to tell them a lie about a field trip, to which he replied he would receive punishment from his parents that's akin to disciplinary actions reserved for slaves and prisoners for lying. Sleepy Joe, why do your parents encourage you to lie instead of punishing you? That doesn't seem like a healthy way to go about things, kind sir. I say to him, Dawes, you can read all about it at my church. He replied, piss on your false church, Sleepy Joe. Mr. Dawes suddenly reached for my gun, but I was far too quick. Plus, every time he took it, he would hit me square in the top of my head with it, which got old fast. I said to Mr. Dawes, kind sir, could being a little girl follow me, to which he replied something about pop knots. He knew not to argue too much, though, because naturally I had my shooting gimmick under my coat. Mr. Dawes was so hesitant he forced me to allow him to lead the way with my shooting gimmick pushed firmly into his ribs. After a little more protest, off we went. You see, folks, back in those days, I was a young savage. Even at the young age of 10, I carried my toe shooting gimmick. My toe shooting gimmick went rat-a-tat-tat, and folks would sit down and shut up. I was so cold-blooded in the streets, the doctor made me take medicine. With my 6-shot shooting gimmick pressed firmly in his back, we strolled down the forest road towards the ice cream parlor. Folks, as we walked along a rural county road, we happened upon a railroad bum. Mr. Dawes prayed with this disgusting vagrant and gave him a whole quarter. It was the craziest thing I had ever seen. I thought better then to ask him why, because I didn't want to hear Bible cartoon stuff, but he told the poor bastard that God loved him. I was shocked and disappointed that he would lie to this hopeless man, because the preacher at the Upside Down Bible Church made it clear that God had no love for the poor, and they were to be tricked and lied to at every moment. The thing about Mr. Dawes that many people don't know is, in spite of his hard exterior, he truly has some weird affinity for animals and the downtrodden, the poor and sick folks and railroad bums. I always found it to be a disgusting show of weakness, possibly even signs of mild retardation, but different strokes for different folks, I suppose. I tried explaining to Dawes 1,000 times how it was okay to play pretend when it came to caring about people that couldn't help themselves. How the Upside-Down Bible at the church my parents took me to even said this. Whenever I'd share this wisdom with him, he would always get mad and spit right in my face, though. Sadly, another sign of his undiagnosed mental illness. He said if he ever becomes president, that he'll make sure that there's no more railroad bumps. That all men, women, and children would never go to bed with pains of hunger in their bellies. Folks, I don't think I'd laughed as hard as I did upon hearing this. Mr. Dawes explained the scientific merits of time itself, the movement of time. I believe, folks, it intrigued me to know, and that's when it hit me that he was saying with more words than his call for how it's only a matter of time before my mind begins to wander. Then he will take my shooting gimmick to hit me in the head with it. Upon this realization, folks, he made good on his words. He had an arm like the great Bambino and was stronger than a dose of castor oil mixed with unleaded gasoline from a broken pump. That is not the way to skip school with a friend, kind sir. Why is there 3 of you now looking to jump me then? Initiate me in some black gang. My head hurts. I told him that my shooting gimmick was for show. Oh, it was filled with blanks. Only after Mr. Dawes then shot out some poor old lady's window did I remember that only real bullets fit my toe shooting gimmick. He then swiftly struck my head again. Folks, after that I walked like Charlie Chaplin for 8 blocks. He wiped his fingerprints and tossed me back my shooting gimmick. He then said a bunch of cuss words and said he was going to flirt with girls. Our adventure continued when we heard whimpering coming from the woods. It reminded me of the sounds in the basement at the Upside Down Bible Church. Folks, listen, Dawes was a ridiculous animal lover, and he saw a poor doggy caught in a hunter's traps. He talked for what seemed like weeks about the least of my creatures, or something similar. After he wouldn't shut up, I agreed to help him save that stupid dog. But folks, listen, I would end up simply loving this dog. Unfortunately, Mr. Dawes is always a party pooper and negative Nancy, so he, of course, began to lie about my new dog Spot. I told Doss to relax. After we take Spot home, we would go flirt with girls. He may be different than other dogs, but it deserves to live and play catch. That's when I saw that Doss had indeed lost his mind. He ranted on about dogmen and werewolves. Mr. Doss is an extremely intelligent person, but his gradually deteriorating grasp on reality finally snapped whenever he tried convincing me that Spot was some sort of monster. Before you knew it, here came Bible cartoon stuff. He said something about angels leaving real estate and leaving their kids or something. Unfortunately, I didn't agree with him on his assessment of the animal. Then after what seemed like an entire day, he suddenly snatched my shooting gimmick and shot that poor dog in the heart. Folks, I was devastated. He kept telling me to look at how there was no blood, but instead maggots and rotten meat falling out of the terrible injury. Though it was strange, I told him that Spot was probably just European or something. He wasn't as well-traveled as I was and didn't understand that every country had citizens, and sometimes those citizens had blood made out of all different kinds of stuff. The English had clam chowder blood, Africans had strawberry yogurt blood. He then asked me where I got that information, to which I replied, the preacher at my church. You mean the upside-down Bible church? Is that the one, Sleepy Joe? There was still a hint of madness in his voice, but my excitement over him wanting to learn about my church overpowered my good judgment. Certainly, Baron, and you can come to our retreat next week when. Suddenly he shot the animal 3 more times. He then stated that those shots were a bullet apiece dedicated to my church, one for people reading false Bibles and sitting in false churches and listening to false teachers. Afterwards, he tossed me my shooting gimmick and said he'd see me in the funny papers. I heard him laughing as he walked off for half a mile. Doss had already left before I could tell him about my magical, red-eyed, sulfur-smelling new friend was okay. The next day I went to his house, walking Spot, who had reappeared in my bedroom the night before. Folks, you couldn't imagine my joy. I knocked on the door of the Doss home to show D how Spot used upside-down Bible magic to heal his gunshot wounds and watch cartoons. His dad came to the door and asked what I wanted, to which I replied, "Kind sir, I want to watch Saturday morning cartoons." Mr. Doss then informed me that it was Sunday afternoon as he closed the door. Confused, I continued to knock, and that's when I saw D look through the blinds. The mean bastard stuck his thumbs into both ears, flared his fingers, and stuck his tongue out at me. He must have thought this was a rip right, because he vigorously laughed until I saw tears in his eyes. All this promptly stopped as he saw my dog. I told him to come pet my friend Spot, but he stared for another full 3 minutes with his mouth open wide. Then his face changed and was very angry. He turned to look at me and said what I assume were cuss words, because I heard his mom say something to him. Immediately, his face went from angry to very nervous before he disappeared from the window. After about an hour, he came out with an axe that wasn't hidden very well, all behind his back. He told me it was candy for my new dog. Being somewhat skeptical, I said okay, and before you know, he struck Spot in the head.